children, loved ones, everyone that we love and cherish, the connections that we have, how strong is that bond that makes us so connected to them that we affect and impact them and they impact us? Sabbath rest. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. This lesson talks about Sabbath again and the rest, but it focuses specifically on why it's still around and why it hasn't changed in a way that kind of how Sabbath afternoon talks about, where either it changed with the resurrection or how it was only for the Jews and how it's become kind of muddied and confusing. And to me, it's interesting, but I wanted to clarify, simplify, so we can really focus on the important things here, because to me, I think this is significant and not many people understand where it comes from. So I actually wanted to dive straight in by having a question, because it talks about in the fourth commandment, right, starting with remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So why? Why do we have to remember and why do we have to keep it holy? Why is this significant? And to really dive in, I want to pause and think about where we ended up, how we're here, and also how the situation with the laws that we have that God gave us and why they're important. So we sinned. Adam sinned and passed it down to us, and we are sinners. And that punishment is death. So that means that is the law. We are supposed to die. But God came and had a plan, right? His plan is to have his son, to have Jesus come down and pay the price for us. And that it was so significant that God, the law that God made, only God could fulfill that in our place to die. So in a way, it shifted the blame, but not entirely. It gave us that chance to accept that freedom to get out. That's where these laws start coming to play. Why is that important? If we look at the sanctuary and how that, in a strange way, connects to the Sabbath that not many people think about, the sanctuary was pointing to this sacrifice, to the importance, and pointing to the laws and explaining and kind of having more of a symbolic or something pointing to when this would happen, right? So the fact that Israel would sacrifice and for all their sins, they would have that representation for them to picture, to understand their position, right? That we, every time we messed up, we were sacrificing God. It was our fault that we were doing that, for us to see what we had done and to understand. But not only that, we had the Sabbath as something that was connecting us to God's identity, to who he was. Remember, the laws don't change, to the point that God had to die to make sure that it could still remain in place, because that's how important the laws were. Because why didn't God change the laws? Why didn't he just say, you know what, you sinned, but I love you so much that I'm just going to say, never mind for this time? Why did it matter that he had to die in our place? Why don't we put more importance on that the law never changed to the point that God had to die to make sure it stayed in place? So then we go to Sabbath. If God's laws are so significant, and before sin even happened, it was created. That's where I want to start thinking about this. And Monday, for example, I find this quote kind of interesting. Sabbath is a celebration of freedom from all the things that keep us in bondage. On Sabbath, we are reminded that there is freedom from sin, not in our own power, but in the power of God, which is offered to us by faith. We also are reminded that this is a freedom we did not earn. What did we do to get it, right? The fact that we just had a loving God that said, you know what, I will find a way and do this, even though it risked everything for God. And that is how it just starts paving the way of why Sabbath is significant. The lesson goes very deep into more about connecting us to God and that importance, and I touched on it in the last week's lesson. But here I wanted to just focus on the fact that there is more to it than we think, that the Sabbath didn't just disappear, didn't just become a simple like, well, if we just switch it to another day, how much harm could that cause, right? And that harm, to me, is why it's important. You see, Tuesday also talks about strangers in your gates and how it says that even people who weren't Israelites who had to keep the Sabbath as well, and how it was for everyone, but they were kind of representing that. And that's important, right? Because to us, if everybody is to keep the Sabbath, if this is something that God placed for the whole world and said, remember, and to keep it holy, what is that doing to us? You see, we think about the Sabbath and we think about its significance and what it might do to help us. We also need to think about the fact that without the Sabbath, a lot of things wouldn't make sense with the connection with God, with the authority that we have. You see, one simple thing. If the Sabbath is God's day, how are we keeping Sunday? How is it that the majority of Christians see Sunday as God's day? If God didn't change it, and it's a man-made day of rest, that means that the actual decision is more than just it's a day. It's actually, if God went through all that trouble, right, went through all of that anguish and grief to give us that chance, and then we publicly choose to keep another day that isn't God's day, a day that He didn't implement, we're ultimately publicly saying that we're picking a man-made day, a man-made religious celebration or whatever it is, to put our faith in man's law and not God's law. So that means, are we accepting the sacrifice that God made for us? Or are we choosing to be in a comfort zone because that is what the majority of people do? We have to remember that this isn't just something that we've done for the sake of doing it, right? We see lots of proof in the Bible. Look at Wednesday with this quote here. This is the leaders of Israel at the time feeling this way, and I think it applies similar to us. So on Wednesday, it has this quote, completely ignoring the wonderful miracle that Jesus had performed and the freedom from disease that He had given this man, the leaders were obsessed that the healed man was carrying his bed in public on Sabbath, instead of seeing how the Lord of the Sabbath utilized the special day. The leaders were intent on maintaining their own rules and regulations. We need to be careful that in our own way, in our own context, we don't make a similar mistake. So here we have something that's a lot more significant just to think about, that even back then they were looking at something that was God's day. They were even twisting it back then and having their own implementation for it. They were thinking to themselves, this is what it means to keep the Sabbath, right? So remembering that, each thing that God has made and represented for us, we've got to look at it and not just go because that's what everybody's saying. It wasn't the popular opinion to have Sabbath that legally standing, that it was beyond God's law. It was man-made. These leaders were following their own law and feeling angered that they were seeing others not follow their own law, to the point that they preferred that obedience above doing what was right. That's what we need to be careful with today. And that's why I wanted to focus on this almost entirely with the lesson. The lesson goes way more in depth with all of this, but I just thought that this was important for us to think about and to show, right, whose side that we're picking. Because if we're picking one side, everything we do has this public outcry almost, the way that we are standing our ground. And we need to really think about this, because it's not just a day at this point. It becomes more significant. I want to just have one more quote and kind of skipping through all of this, and I just wanted to think about this a little bit more with the Sabbath. All through the week, we are to have the Sabbath in mind and be making preparation to keep it according to the commandment. We're not merely to observe the Sabbath as a legal matter, because if we're just doing things for the sake of doing it, are we actually doing it? Everything that God placed in there was not just for the sake of doing it. It's a better standard for us. It's a better level that we could reach. It's supposed to help us in everything. Laws of gravity, laws of physics, all these laws that God has created, it's not harming us, it's helping us. The same way, these laws are there for that spiritual side, for us, our hearts, our minds, to be able to reach out and connect, to be able to have the benefits of actually having God here with us, helping us, and to give us that strength and that ability. This is the day that we can actually connect with God, to recharge, to actually free ourselves. The lesson talks about slavery and how we're trapped by all these things, and how one day allows us to actually detach and have that freedom. If it's so significant, how are we possibly just ignoring the most vital thing? If we are running out of blood, we desperately need blood because of oxygen and other things. Similarly, maybe we're detaching ourselves from this lifeline that God has given us, and we're making an excuse by saying it's not as significant. But God's death points otherwise. So I want you to think, how are you utilizing this lifeline? Are you actually utilizing it, or are you ignoring it and very quickly losing the one thing that could help you?